just reached past the hour of 12 o'clock where we are, 10 o'clock in the US in the evening yesterday, and not sure any other time zones that visitors might be joining us from. So thank you for joining us and welcome to this webinar specifically on such short notice in light of recent events. I'd like to start off by acknowledging the traditional custodians on the land that we meet here today, as well as any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us. I pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and myself coming to you live from Sydney in Australia. I am joining you from Gadigal land of the Eora Nation. Whatever your political beliefs are, July 13, 2024, at a political rally in Butler, Pennsylvania, 6 to 8 rounds of ammunition were fired out of an AR-15 rifle. This rifle was legally purchased and owned by the alleged shooter's father. One person was left dead and a few others wounded. These are the facts. What we're here to do today is not get into a political discussion of who's right and who's wrong, but really unpack the learnings of what we can derive from the situation of this nature. And joining me today as we unpack this is global experts in the field, Dr. Gav Schneider, who is a presidential level close protection specialist himself. Mike Gips, listed as the #1 IFSEC Global Thought Leader and former CSO Chair at ASIS International. And Chris Stitt, hopefully will be joining us if the tech manages to play game with us, the former Deputy Regional Director, Diplomatic Security International Programs, the Western Hemisphere Affairs of the US State Department. Gav, if I could get the ball rolling with you and get things underway. Would you mind just sharing a brief intro about yourself, as well as just a minute or two comment and your thoughts on the events that took place on July 13th? Mike, I'll ask you to go next, and hopefully Chris will join us and by then, and then Chris can join us then. So Gav, over to you.
Thanks, Dave, and thank you to everybody who's joined us on this short notice webinar. So for those who aren't familiar with my background, I did start my career in close protection, landed up through roughly about 15 years of operational experience. I personally coordinated protective detail for Vice President Al Gore when he came into South Africa, I think in 2001, landed up protecting the President of Equatorial Guinea, looked after the Prime Minister of Kenya, and quite a few others. So I've had experience on the close protection side at various levels. I also did my master's degree study, which is now 20 years ago, on how to professionalize the close protection sector, and used the US, the UK, Israel, and Australia's comparative studies to try and understand how we can do that better. So I think the first thing that I'd like to say is that obviously there's an ongoing investigation and we don't have all the facts. Therefore, we can't provide robust factual feedback at this stage. So noting that we have limited information, we will share what we feel comfortable sharing based on what's available and equally provide comment accordingly. I think there's a big challenge. When something terrible happens, and let's not get this wrong, this was a terrible incident. People died, people got shot. It doesn't really matter where your politics sit. Somebody at the top of the leadership food chain was almost killed. It's significantly challenging when something like this happens. And we tend to want to just blame. We tend to want to just go, it's X's fault. But pragmatically, no security structure has infinite resources, not even the US Secret Service, right? And everyone is a master of hindsight. So it's really easy after the event to go, oh, how did that blind spot on the roof get missed? You know, there was a clear line of sight. We don't know the information and why the decision-making was made the way it did. But if we look at the way the protectors plus the law enforcement structures responded once an attack was confirmed, I mean, that certainly is a world-class response that saved not just one life, but many. So I think there's a lot we can take away from this incident. I'm also keen for us throughout this webinar to start talking about what this means for everyday civilians in crowded places and people who want to join, political or symbolic gatherings, what this means risk-wise for them. And probably the last point I'd like to make before handing over to Mike is that we need to be very careful at times like this, because one of the things that an attacker attempts to do is to create fear and influence an audience. And if we stop living and we stop being who we need to be and we curtail our beliefs, all we do is we let these crazy people who do crazy things win. And we need to make sure that we don't respond only with a fear-based response when we look at these things. Thanks, Dave. That's probably a good start from our side. Thank you.
Thanks, Gav. And Mike, if you could take the mic.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. A real pleasure. It is 10 o'clock here, so my eyes sag a little bit. It's not the content or the company, it's just the hour. But I'm excited to be here. I have a background as a lawyer, a security professional, and as a journalist, writer, researcher. I worked for a number of years for ASIS as editor of their magazine, and I started the CSO Roundtable, which a lot of listeners from the program, a group within ASIS for senior security executives at large organizations. And I really acted as a consultant for them and a resource. I ended up becoming the first chief security officer at ASIS, as well as chief global knowledge and learning officer. And for the past 5 years, I've been out on my own, helping startups in security, advising senior security teams, corporate teams, and do research on the industry. So it's a real honor to be here. I will say I may differ from Gav on this, and we'll have a healthy discussion. I'm not going to talk politics. However, I have to set the stage for this political situation in the United States, how toxic and adversarial it is, without taking sides. There's a lot of bad stuff to go around, but I will be setting the stage of what the situation is like in the United States and in a lot of the rest of the world politically right now, the divisions that we're seeing. While I'm not going to make any political statement, because I'm about as middle of the road as you can get. So I'm really looking forward. I hope Chris can get involved, because he's an excellent, well-spoken professional. There's a lot to add to this conversation. Let's turn it over to Dave. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. And while our technical team is trying vigorously in the background to get Chris on to join us, let's perhaps, and Chris can always jump in when he's able to get on, but let's perhaps get the conversation started. The way that I'd like to approach our next sort of 40, 50 minutes together is before, during, and after. So if we sort of unpack and have sort of almost three interrelated discussions on what happened before, what happened during, and what are the lessons that we can learn after, and best practices that we can apply in our organizations going forward. Abe Lincoln says, never waste a good war. So while we don't want bad things to happen, we certainly want to extrapolate as much information and learnings as we can and know better with the panel that we have here. So if we get started with the before, right? And Gav, if I could start off with you here. First thing we do when we're planning an event is conduct a risk assessment and a threat identification, right? How can organizations enhance their risk assessment procedures and processes to better, to your point, we're never going to stop bad things from happening, but to reduce the likelihood of bad things happening and perhaps the potential impact that could have? Gav?
Thanks, Dave. So I think just so that the audience, I know some of you are incredibly experienced security and risk experts, others may not be. So let's just talk about a little bit what happens pre any sort of protection activity, just so we're on the same page. Noting again that the investigation has not occurred, we don't have the specific information of why certain decisions were made, but realistically, any sort of movement with a high profile principal or person you're protecting will have an immense amount of planning that happens ahead of time. There will be a huge amount of work put into threat assessments. Okay? And on that note, it's important to realize that somebody at a presidential candidate level is going to be receiving probably hundreds of death threats a week. And there's a dedicated team that's going to be going through all of those and trying to figure out what's real, what's not real, which do we investigate, don't we? Okay. Equally, then, there'll be a planning team that will go to each site, do a site assessment, determine what the security overlay needs to look like for that site, balance it with the threat picture and the resources available. So that's a very dynamic piece because again, it doesn't matter what agency you are, you don't have unlimited resources. You don't have the ability to control the environment in many places. In fact, I recall one of my first serious protection details. We were looking after a political figure. He was number 3 on a hit list, and number 1 had already been killed by a long-range sniper attack. And this political rally was happening in a built-up area that had high-rise buildings everywhere. And I still remember my planning leader at the time, because I was a little more junior, going, we are absolutely stuffed when it comes to a long-range type attack. And from our perspective, anything more than 50 or 60 meters away is probably considered long-range. All we can do is try and shield with our bodies as effectively as possible to limit the target allocation or the target acquisition capability. So all of that happens during the planning phase. There's lots of moving pieces and there's lots of different people involved there. From a general perspective, I think one of the things that's really important for us to remember is that this planning saved lives. The ability to respond the way they responded when an attack happened, to take President Trump to ground, provide cover, provide a shield as they evacuated him. That doesn't, even though that might be the response piece, that all happened in advance due to training and preparation. So when we look at an overlay, it's very easy again to go, there was a failure. We didn't cover, that one line of fire or that rooftop. It's probably early to assess that. But realistically, if you are looking at doing any sort of mass gathering event that has people of prominence, symbolic value, or ideological value attending, you need to consider the reality of an effective security overlay. We're probably past the era where we can go, hey, it's just a mass gathering, everyone's having a good time, to an era now where we know we have people who are politically, ideologically, or mentally unstable and may act in a way that could cause harm to others. So with that knowledge in line, honestly, it doesn't matter whether you're in Australia or you're in the US, there's a duty of care that is required to make sure we protect people attending an event. I'm sure there's a lot more we can go into, but I'm keen to hear what Mike's got to say on the preparation piece.
Absolutely. And everything you said, Gav, I agree with. Solid advice, good background. I'm just going to kind of work at the interstices of what you said. So, yes, you're right about it just being a supremely high-profile event. Let's be clear, the President of the United States is such a uniquely high-profile target. One of the few people in the world that's known to everyone, and someone about whom everyone in the world has an opinion, strong opinion, usually. And if you consider the state of the political discourse in the world, especially in the US, it's toxic, polemical, strident. We, at least in the United States, and read the same facts in different ways, and the facts are delivered to us in different ways. There are endless media entities that will deliver whatever truth that we want. Take the same facts. I was watching CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, and other stations during the nonstop coverage of the aftermath of the assassination attempts. The same facts, completely different coverage. You would think that it was a completely different event, assigning blame, criticism here, there, theories that were unfounded. But the basics of what Gav said, completely correct. You have to start with risk assessment and threat identification. And I think a lot of you're probably, hopefully not going to be responsible for President of the United States, but whatever executive you're protecting, something that is often overlooked is understanding the personal profile, personal, professional, ideological profile of your executive. Are they a public figure? Are they outspoken on social media or in the mass media? Could they have open feuds? Same thing would apply to their family members or close colleagues. Is the executive connected to controversial beliefs or issues? Someone is an outspoken Israel supporter these days that obviously merit additional consideration for security. But I've dealt with principals whose companies deal with conducted animal research, or outspoken advocates for LGBTQ plus, or vocally pro-life or anti-abortion. That really amps up the risk profile. So you have to be attuned to that. And it's critical to monitor social media because people brag or let their guard down there. They may throw up a manifesto or try to attract a following. That's its own subculture. So that's getting a little more specific than Gav's general background, but I just want to get across that when you are doing your risk assessment, threat identification for your principal, it's not just the event, it's their personal, professional, political, ideological profile that causes they're associated.
Thanks, Mike. And to your point, a lot of crazies, no better words than to use that. And there are a lot of things that can't be predicted. So we can do our assessments to the best of our ability, but when it comes to ideologies and drivers, it's very difficult to protect against those. On that point, and that provides a great segue into what I'd like to discuss now. So we need to find that balance between going over the top and too much security, if there is a thing called too much security, and not enough. Now, Gav, finding that balance between just that right balance is exceptionally difficult to maintain, particularly at a political motivated rally of this nature, such high profile environment with emotions and drivers and ideologies at play. How do we balance what is too much and too little in an environment such as this?
Great question, Dave. Thank you. I think the first piece, and I'm not sure who actually coined this phrase. I'd love to give them credit, whoever you are, but the challenge with security is it's always too much until it's not enough. And that part is really a challenge because consistently with security, you're actually got a juggling act or a seesaw between comfort and convenience and security. The more secure we are, the less freedom we have, the less comfort and convenience we have. And particularly at a public place or a politically motivated rally where confidence sharing and the perception that we have a vetted audience, okay, is often one of the challenges we have to overcome. It makes it quite difficult for us to instantly just go, this is the correct security overlay for this scenario, and it will be perfect each time. So don't get me wrong, like the Secret Service are the best in the business with this stuff. They will have the methodologies, they will have the models, they will have the structures and the deployment processes once the risk level has been reached. I think we also need to be a little bit careful also because we often have this perception that, our attackers, our threats are stupid and that, it's easy to prevent them committing an attack. Let's just understand for a second what happened. Somebody put a lot of work, and I would say this is probably not just one person, just based on how difficult it is to have picked that roof at that line of fire at that time. But the information will come out during the investigation as to how that worked. But practically, this is not a simple thing. And for that person to have unnoticed, climbed onto a roof, developed a line of fire and pulled off the shots that he did, and however you want to look at it, divine intervention, serendipity, luck. A 5.56 round with the trajectory that it was going should have killed President Trump, should have killed him. It's not ambiguous. Luckily that he turned his head at the right time, that he's still alive. So I think when we actually start looking at what is the right balance of security, we also need to look at the earlier conversation Mike and I just had around threats and risks and what we are facing. And realistically, when we look at that piece, I think it's interesting because the little bits that we see on TV, for example, do nothing to show you the amount of security that's there. there are cordons and layers and cordons that happen that nobody knows about. Okay, there are plainclothes operators that are constantly scanning crowds, they're constantly looking and trying to identify anything out of the ordinary. So for an attack like this to happen, it's not just an omission, it's a significant failure, but equally it's a significant success for the attacker who was able to overcome all of those barriers. So the message kind of coming back that I would say is very, very, very few organizations and corporates have the resources that the Secret Service have. If this happened to the Secret Service, it can happen at any event, and it can happen quite easily in lots of different scenarios and lots of different ways. So it is important for us not to be allocating blame, but to learn, to actually go, if this level of vulnerability occurred, it's a clear indicator that we need to probably be a little more serious about the way we provide security, the way we do our risk assessments, and the way we overlay these things. It's not just a simple thing of, more Secret Service, more guards, more guns, more cops. It's really about those things deployed in the right place at the right time in the right manner, because more of that stuff can actually create more vulnerability if it's not structured properly. So practically, and this is the last point before I hand over to Mike, it's important for us to just look at what is that overarching lesson. And I think that overarching lesson from my perspective is that we have, this is not new, right? Assassination attempts have been going on for thousands of years. Okay, what we have seen, though, is that there's a perception we should be doing better now because of modern technology, modern research, modern training methods, lessons learned. Yeah, but that old saying of, and I think it was the IRA originally, that said, and they were talking about Margaret Thatcher, that basically she has to get her protection and safety and security right all the time. They only have to get lucky once. It's an incredibly hard job to do, and it's really easy to be an armchair expert and say, they should have done this and they should have done that. I can almost guarantee you that if the risk level was high enough and the threat level was high enough and the picture was right, that oversights like this shouldn't have happened. But practically, we're all humans. And I think we also need to remember that if you were doing the threat and risk assessment on this event, you would have gone friendly crowd in a friendly neighborhood, no direct confirmed threat for that event. You probably would have gone a standard security overlay is good enough. And without feedback from the investigation, I think we should reserve judgment. But the lesson and the hard lesson learned for those of you listening is don't just assume that we'll be okay. Don't just assume that what you did on the last event is going to be as good or effective enough on the next one. And we've got to be agile and adaptable based on what's happening around us. Thanks, Dave.
I think, Mike, before I ask you to jump in there, we operate in a world of VUCA, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And now we've added the complex digitalized environment. So I've got Chris on the audio. I'm going to try and patch Chris in if we can. So for my panelists at the back, can you give me a thumbs up if you can hear Chris? Chris, can you speak for us?
Hi, Dave. Yeah, thank you very much. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, we've got a thumbs up. So if you speak slowly and clearly, we can get a thought through. Chris, I know you've been following what we've been saying in the background. Can you shed some comments and some light into your thoughts and opinions on Gav's most recent comment?
So one of the things Gav mentioned there was some biases. And it's one of the things that I actually wanted to comment on as we look at this overall situation. Because there's some things that I think it would be really useful for those of you, especially who are not from the United States, to understand. So in addition to spending over 25 years as a supervisory special agent with the U.S. Department of State's Diplomatic Security Service, I also teach Homeland Security classes at George Mason University. And through that, one of the classes I teach is law enforcement and Homeland Security. And a couple of months ago, I was doing some research, and I pulled it up again today. Just a couple of interesting facts to set a framework here. One is, in the United States, we have 17,541 separate state and local law enforcement agencies. Think about that for a minute. 17,541 541 separate state and local agencies. That doesn't count the federal agencies. The state of Pennsylvania itself actually has the highest number of state and local agencies of any state in the union, which is kind of funny because most people would think Texas, but they come in second to Pennsylvania. And Pennsylvania has 995 separate agencies. Of those, 896 are considered local police departments. So let's just look at the county that we're talking about. In that county alone, there's 20 separate law enforcement agencies. Why this is important? How often do you think these agencies engage in this sort of activity? When you consider that there's 20 agencies just in that county, right? The answer is probably never. So they don't have a lot of the experience, and what they've got, though, is their mental models, their biases, things like that. Now, as we look at it, I've been reading through a lot of the context today, and a lot of people, when they heard the gunshots, they thought it was fireworks. Because there's that bias here of, well, this could never happen here. Or there's that bias here that says, wow, look at all of this security, we must be safe. And it's interesting because even if you read the comments from the sheriff of Butler County, one of the things he talks about is that when he first heard what were the gunshots, he thought, well, that must be fireworks. A trained law enforcement officer doing that. The other point that I'd like to make is that considering this vast number of law enforcement agencies, they don't have integrated communications. Often at an event like this, what happens is there will be a command post. And the point of the command post is to have the representatives from each of the different agencies there, so that if a call comes in, say from Butler Township Police Department, that there's a suspicious person and that they have officers going to look, then that can be passed to the other agencies involved, including the Secret Service. I don't want to second guess this. I don't know if that communication did or did not happen, but clearly there was a bias there, because if it had been communicated to the Secret Service that, hey, we have somebody on a roof, and that had gotten to the Secret Service, pretty much immediately their counter sniper team would have been focused in on that.
Thanks, Chris. And sorry to cut you off there. You've raised a really, really good point there. And Mike, I'm going to come back to you for comment in just a second. But we've got probably one of the world's greatest thought leaders on behavioral science on the line, and it would be a missed opportunity if we didn't take advantage of it. Just discussing that concept of biases that you raised, Chris. Let's just chat about that for a second. Gavin, if I can ask you to weigh in on that. So there's so many different biases that the audience would have experienced during an event like this. Cognitive dissonance, bystander effect, social proof, all of these sorts of things. Seeing what other people are doing, following the same thing. We're in a place where it's we don't expect something like this. That normalcy bias. We're at a place where the Secret Service is, so it should be a place that is safe, to your point, Chris. Gav, talk us through some of those aspects potential pitfalls that we shouldn't be falling into at an event of this nature or anything else like that, for example.
Thanks, Dave. And we could make this a very long discussion. I will make it a relatively short one. The challenge we've got is that we're dealing with humans. And humans are variable and highly biased in the way that we perform. So if we talk about bias, honestly, it's a bias that affects every single person. All of us are biased. That's how we make decisions. What you can see in hindsight, though, is how some of these biases have played out in practice. You can see it in the reactions. And in fairness, there's probably also a fair amount of confirmation bias, for example, that might have happened from the threat assessment team who were going, this is a friendly place with a friendly crowd. Maybe we don't need the same level of security overlay that we need in a hostile environment, which could literally be that simple in terms of why, potentially there weren't other layers, other cordons, other sweeps, other patrols, or additional counter sniper teams deployed. But I think the equal part now, and Mike, you raised the comment earlier that we need to be very, very careful. And this, while this has been brought to the fore from a US perspective, I see this in Australia tremendously. We are geopolitically in a very sensitive global period. There's wars all over the place. There's political agenda items, whether it's Ukraine, whether it's the Middle East, whether it's just domestic. We also haven't properly recovered from COVID. And when I say haven't properly recovered, I'm not talking about the physical and disease impacts. I'm talking about the fact that we destabilized our entire world's population. We locked them away. We changed the way they behave, the way they think. And we never did any sort of reckoning post that for recovery. We just went, let's get back to business. So we've actually got a really awkward melting pot of challenges ahead of us. We've got the individuals who are feeling disgruntled, who are feeling broken, who are feeling disconnected. Mike mentioned the term misinformation and disinformation earlier. And Mike gave just a few examples of touring different TV channels just to see that. It's pretty scary because it's really easy for somebody to get confirmation of whatever bias they have. It's very easy for them to actually get into an echo chamber where the bandwagon effect and herd mentality convince them they're correct. And because of the fact that we've got the world's knowledge available to us at any given time, somebody could literally stay at home and learn how to become a very efficient sniper. They could then practice on first-person shooter TV games and become quite competent. Because while, I guess a lot of people will say, hey, that was pretty close. I think it was around 500 feet. That's still a hard shot to take. It's not an easy thing to do. So realistically, we've got to actually understand globally where humans are at, and where we're at is not a good place. So in terms of security risk and general risk, I would really be encouraging those listening in, and those of you who have tuned in, I'm probably preaching to the converted, that we are not going to have an era of instant safety and security for the next little bit. You are going to have to put work and effort into securing whatever you do and keeping your people and those who attend safe and secure, because the opposition, and as I say, we just started with, mentally unstable, self-motivated, self-radicalized individuals. We're not even moving to the other extreme, which is state-sponsored, very negative behavior. And there's a ton of that going on. The world is not simple. It's getting more complex. And if we don't understand humans, we're constantly going to be on the back foot. Thanks, Dave.
I consider myself educated, informed, and have friends and colleagues and associates who are the same, like-minded. Someone asked me this morning, a very highly placed security professional, someone I trust and respect, not in the United States, said, now that President Biden has sort of put out a call for civility and lowering tensions, and can't we all just get along and let's talk, right? Is there hope now that it's going to bring down the tension, create more tolerance, create more dialogue? I said there's the hope, but it's not going to happen. I mean, and I'm a pretty optimistic person, but I don't think it's going to happen. And I'll tell you, and again, this is another kind of bias. It's a small sample bias. What we're going to tell you right now. So I've talked to maybe 20 people, right? I said I try to surround myself with fairly informed, knowledgeable, questioning people, non-conspiracy theorists. I talked about 20 different people, and I got the entire range of responses or comments about the assassination attempt. A fair number of people who said, I just wish that it was an inch, off, that he got hit, which is horrifying. And these aren't bad people. I've got other people who say Biden called this hit. Absolutely, it was Biden. Or this was staged. And you have people on the left who said it was staged, get him to get Trump, more, more favorability. People on the right stage for different reasons, and these are sort of the people in the middle who are not extremists. Like everyone's being forced to an extreme. There's so few people who are willing to have conversations about this. Everybody's like, it's a lot of the confirmation bias. I think that's really at play here, and it's the media feeding our needs. Everybody has a channel. I'm surprised there's not a Michael Gips channel that says exactly what I want to hear. Right? It's coming up. Actually, there's a Black Mirror episode that's like that. So I commend that to you. Another issue, and I'll let others speak, Chris and Gav. Another thing is, yes, we can't judge, the Secret Service. There's a lot of preparation. They train. There's a million Monday morning quarterbacks out there. I don't know if Monday morning quarterback is a term, but Monday morning rugby, rugby. I don't know what, whatever player. Okay, sorry, I'm betraying my ignorance, my American ignorance. Who are saying, "Oh, the Secret Service has done this." The way they brought President Trump out of there was, they left a lot of. They didn't do it timely. They left a lot of exposure. Blah blah blah. They should never have let him, raise his fist, even though it's an iconic moment now. But the optics were terrible for the Secret Service, and I can almost guarantee there's going to be investigation. And the fact that everyone has a camera now, everything is documented, and there's footage of people saying there's a guy crawling up there, and no one's doing anything about it. So no matter what they did, it doesn't matter anymore, right? Forget about, as Gav said earlier, nobody cares if you prevented something. They only care if something happened. They only complain about security until something happens, and then they complain that there wasn't enough. So that's exactly what's happening. They're going to get the blame. There's, thank God that President Trump wasn't killed, but other people, that firefighter was. Other people were injured, so it's tragic. So no matter what you think about the preparation, there's, where security professionals are always in a tight spot because they have to show their value on the cheap, really, for the least possible amount of resources. But if they spend 1 cent too little and something happens, they get all the blame. So, and when you look at it, when the public optics, there goes your job. If you're the CSO, if you're the head of executive protection, there goes your career, perhaps. So, I know it wasn't the original question, but I thought it was worth commenting on, making a point.
Absolutely, Mike, and your insights there are tremendously valuable. And I think that we could probably have, I think I counted about 6 different webinars just on some of the points that you mentioned over there, that we could really unpack in a lot of greater detail. But not wanting to get into the weeds too much, to give our audience the best sort of range of before, during, and after. And on that note, please feel free, just a reminder, to use the Q&A box to post your questions through to our panelists. Chris, if I could loop you in at this stage. Chris, let's talk about comms. We're now in the during phase of the event, right? So we've spoken a little bit about before preparation, what's too much, what's too little, etc. We're now during the event. We've spoken about biases quite significantly, but we've now got this mass hysteria, right? And we've got gunshots fired. We don't know if they're gunshots. Is it fireworks? Is it not fireworks? Gunshots can't happen here. We don't really know what's happening at the moment other than law enforcement and security on site, right? So Mike and Gav spoke, I'm not sure if you heard at the beginning, about communication and how important effective communication between various stakeholders in this type of environment is. From your perspective, what are some of those key points about communication and how it should be managed between the various stakeholders, personnel, and obviously the crowd during a crisis of this nature?
So, I think number one is preparation ahead of time is going to be absolutely critical. so that people know and are briefed, hey, if X happens, your responsibilities are YZQ, right, for each individual. And a lot of times how that will be set up is areas of responsibility. So prior to this event happening, there's a number of what we call countdown meetings. And in the countdown meetings, what happens is they review the plan and they say, here is exactly what we expect to happen in the time frames we expect it to happen. And if something goes wrong, here's everybody's responsibility. And these countdown meetings typically involve all of the stakeholders. So they'll involve, certainly the Secret Service. They'll involve the local police departments. They'll involve EMS. They'll involve, traffic control, whoever else may actually be involved in something like this. And you then are responsible for taking those actions for your area of responsibility, basically until told otherwise. So as part of that countdown meeting, they would run through, what is the in extremis plan, such as if there was an event like this. And you actually saw that come into play in this event. You had not only the Secret Service agents doing their job to protect and cover the president, you had the Secret Service tactical team come up on stage and surround them and take over their sectors of fire, their zones of responsibility, along with, and you probably, if you watch the videos, people in different uniforms, tactical teams from these other agencies that I mentioned earlier, and all of that is going to be pre-planned, pre-positioned. Now, we had a really interesting phenomenon in this event in particular, which is if you think about fight, flight, or freeze, the professionals immediately reacted, jumped into that fight mode. And again, Secret Service protecting the president, making a body bunker over him, tactical teams, etc. Most of the crowd froze. And that actually was useful to the overall situation because it was over so quickly that it then allowed for those other people who had been injured to be attended to, and it allowed for smoother communication and operations for clearing of the facility. You didn't have the mayhem that you potentially could have had. And in that sense, I think we were actually lucky. Because once that happens, and I think of things like, the Who concert in Cincinnati back in the 70s where, dozens of people were killed in the stampede, and that mob becomes uncontrollable, what you don't have is direct communications typically between all of these different organizations. As I mentioned earlier, you might have a command post, and it's funny because I'm sitting here talking with my hands even though you can't see me, but you'll have a command post where the different representatives, but all of their radios going off at once and trying to tell everybody else what's going on separate channels, and literally not being able to communicate via radio or electronically with somebody that you have line of sight of, but is 20 feet away and you can't call them. And that becomes one of the challenges, that we have. It's kind of like the reports that we're seeing that people said, hey, there's somebody suspicious who went on top of that building. And I don't want to go through the biases again, but, I'm sure the police, some of the police officers were like, okay, so somebody's out there. What did they communicate and to whom? And how did that get passed? Right? And since 9/11, there's been an effort to create interoperable communications. But as I mentioned, 17,000, police departments across the country, it is a really hard nut to crack. So I think that's a good part of it. Anybody else want to jump in on that?
Chris is exactly right with the communications and the fact that these agencies, we don't know whether they drill together or not. And Chris was earlier said probably not all that often, and that they don't have these many kinds of events, which I tend to agree with. And yes, having everyone on radios that are actually can communicate with each other on the same channel or on the same frequency. That's something that was addressed, tried to be addressed after 9/11. But even if you're on the same frequency, it's a lot of people. Can you get your message through the jumble of noise, right? You have different channels, different agencies on different channels. You have so many people. How do you coordinate that? It becomes a really complicated effort in communication, keeping contact through, and you can't function that way. So there has to be a better way. Gav, I'll defer to you.
Thanks, Mark, and also conscious of time, and I see there's some really nice questions coming into the Q&A box. So just maybe one or two thoughts on comms, and then we can switch to the Q&A. If you think about any sort of corporate organization functioning during a business as usual period, one of the biggest failures there is miscommunication or poor communication. So when we fast forward that into a live event where things are happening in split seconds, communication is incredibly difficult. And it's not just the technical aspects that were mentioned by Mark and Chris. There's also the pragmatic reality of people freezing, not being able to communicate properly, people panicking, not being able to communicate properly, and also different terms, different descriptors for different things. So it's not simple. It really is not simple. And practically, if we take that all into account, it actually makes the response and the action look better. It actually was quite a well-structured response. If you look from the time the shot was taken from the counter sniper to the actions that were taken by the protection team, it was comparatively well handled. So I think there's lots of lessons learned there, and parts of this attack, no question, will eventually become learning for everyone who wants to be a protector moving forward. And equally, parts of the failings will also become case examples of what we need to do to strengthen. So I think lots of lessons learned here. Happy to switch to questions, Dave, bearing in mind we've got 7 or 8 minutes left.
Absolutely. Thanks, Gav. And again, there's another topic for a webinar right there. Just to get to the questions, thank you for those that have sent them through. Gav, if I could throw this one to you. Gabriel's asked, what type of training do you recommend for security teams to prepare for and manage such critical events? Just a short snapshot of what you would suggest there.
So I think we need to be really careful when we say what sort of training, because obviously from an Australian perspective, private sector security can't work armed. So we're relying on the law enforcement structures to provide the armed capability. It's a bit different in different places. But realistically, right now, threat assessment, risk analysis skills are critical. Being able to do proper site evaluations, not just assume because a site already has a plan, that plan is good enough. Actually understanding who will be there on the day, really, really important. Using whatever you've got. One of the things that's providing me with a lot of confidence over the last while is how well I'm seeing in Australia, law enforcement is starting to work with private security and vice versa. And there's now an understanding that we can't do it alone. We have to collaborate and do this together. So I think that's really important. There's no doubt about it that if we actually want to look at protection, we have to look at the most extreme version of protection. And while Australia follows an escape, hide, tell methodology, not a run, hide, fight methodology, under the escape and hide within the ANZ CTC guidance, there's still a fight if necessary or if you have no choice. And we have to have the ability to be able to neutralize an attacker. So when we look at mass gatherings and armed situations, the more movement capability, so the freedom of movement the attacker has, and the more time they have, the more damage we're going to see. So we need to train to prevent that. Hostile reconnaissance identification, hostile surveillance identification, effective actions on and responses, and then lessons learned and reviews. So it's the whole sequence in terms of training. I don't think we can separate anything. And in the world we're in today, it has to happen quicker, faster, and we also need to have a digital overlay there. Most, and I think Mike mentioned it earlier, most of the early warning indicators are online, they're social. So if we know where to look, we can often find lots of hints, tips, and tricks that help us prepare. So if you're only looking at the physical security components, you're missing a lot of what's important today. Thanks, Dave.
Thanks, Gav. And just mindful of time again, that we could really go into that one. Mike, if I could throw the next question from Moni to you. Based on the current security challenge and this particular incident, what are some of the emergency trends in security that organizations should be aware of?
We see a lot of this stuff on social media, being fomented by social media, being previewed on social media, being live streamed on social media. There's that. The one trend that ties into training that I've seen is, typically you train your security people, right? But who's most likely to encounter these incidents? In this case, the some of the attendees saw the gunman first, right? Other people. So if you're having an event, say you're holding an event at a hotel or a stadium, it's likely that a ticket taker or an usher or a restaurant person or a valet or someone will be the person who engages or is attacked or sees first. So you got to bring them into it and talk them through the your procedures, and actually talk to them and say, okay, run the scenarios that you think will be are most likely or that you're most afraid of, that your risk assessment has determined that are most likely or or have the highest the biggest threat value, and say, okay, here's the scenario. What do you do? And nobody, I can almost guarantee you, like what I've seen, they never know what to do. The first thing, you got to get them to think that way and to walk them through and say, okay, I'd call this person. Okay, go ahead and call that person. See what that person does. That person does. I don't know either. You got to get them involved. I don't want to take too much time with this, but that's what I'm seeing, getting people who are actually at the front. The chief security officer or the head chief of police is never at the forefront of it. It's always somebody who is on the front line. And I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Mike. And I really wanted to get to discussing exercising as well, because I believe it's such a crucial part of it. But unfortunately, time has just run away with us too quickly. But just 2 points that I wanted, and Chris, I'm going to loop you in here as well. Anonymous has posted a really good question as well and said, realistically, what are the lessons we can learn from this event that actually can be applied elsewhere? Frequency-wise, the level of planning that we see at events like this can't be applied in the scenarios that we see more gun-related incidents. Chris?
Yeah. So, and I'll actually start with building on something that Mike was just talking about that I think fits in here perfectly, which is the importance of wargaming, the importance of running those what-if scenarios. So if we're talking about lessons that can be learned here that can actually be applied elsewhere, one of the things I think we had here was, we've talked about a little bit of a failure of imagination, that people were looking at it and with their biases of, well, we've got all this security here, we're going to be safe. The bias of, well, it's, we're in a friendly area, things like that. Checking those biases by doing the what if. You know what? What if something, in order to, put yourself in a different mode and context to be ready to respond to it. And you can do that individually, or you can do that, with your different teams. And as I said earlier, that's one of the things that these countdown meetings that they try to do. They try to say, if this were to happen, what is everybody's responsibility and what are they going to do? Frequency-wise, the level of planning that we see at events like these can't be applied in scenarios because we're seeing more gun-related incidents. That's true. You're not going to always have, the resources that they actually had available for this event. But what you've got to do is you've got to be able to say, all right, what do we have? What should we do? Run through those scenarios Make sure that you are prepared for them. And really, it's that mental challenge to make sure that you've got that situational awareness and the ability to make the quick decisions that need to be made. And I hope that helps.
It does indeed. And as we wrap it up, I'm going to end off by firstly thanking our panel members. But before we do that, Gav, Mike, Chris, Gav, if I could start with you, just a one-sentence closing thought that our audience could take away from this session as a pragmatic takeaway that they could apply or think about in their own environments.
Thanks, Dave. So practically, for most people who don't deal with presidential level events and the need to secure such events, but do deal with, gatherings, events, people coming together, or attend these things in their own right, I would urge you to start with thinking around what exposure do you have to yourself. So if you're attending a rally or you're attending a place of symbolic importance that could be targeted, don't just assume that everybody there is going to keep you safe. Have your own escape routes, your own evacuation plans, develop your own security overlay as an individual, particularly if you take your family with, that should be even more important. So don't just assume because you're going somewhere that your safety is guaranteed. I think the next big takeaway to close off from my side is that we should not let crazies who do crazy things dictate the quality of decision-making and the way we live our lives. Fear is not a good driver for decision-making, but fear should help educate what we prepare for. The more we prepare, the less we have to fear, the more we're able to respond. But I do think we're in an era now, and it's fascinating because people like us, when I say like us, I'm including almost everybody listening to this webinar, we tend to have accepted the reality that sometimes people use violence as a language and that sometimes bad things can happen to good people. I'd urge everybody who's listening to go and talk to people higher up the food chain in their organizations and get them to realize this is not going away. We're going to continually see people with mental health issues or ideologically driven motives resorting to violence. And if we ignore it, the duty of care sits with those of us who are not doing anything about it. All we can ask everyone to do is the best they can from where they are to make a difference. It won't be perfect, but ignoring the threats and pretending they're not here doesn't help at all. Thanks, Dave, and thank you to everyone for listening in, and thanks to my panelists for joining us.
Thanks, Gav. Mike, a quick closing thought from you? Sure.
I'll try to keep this in one sentence. In this case, it was an outside loner / crazy. In your case, in listeners' cases, it may well be an insider. Watch an insider threat. It could be easy for someone who's working as a valet, a caterer, an usher, or some other transitory job to get inside. So you need to make sure that both background checks are conducted to the extent that they want to make them pass through entry screening. So really, insider threat is significant. Don't overlook that. Thank you.
Great point there, Mike. Thank you. Chris, last parting thought from you?
I think it's going to be along what I've been trying to get across here all the way through, which is find ways to, and Gav touched on this as well, check your biases. Make sure that you're not just, feeling overly comfortable and safe because you think you're in a safe environment. Play that wargaming what if, and, make sure that you're able to kind of think through those different scenarios and how would you respond to it. And that can be security, safety, whatever other kind of stuff you want. But make sure that you're actively thinking and keeping yourself situationally aware.
Thanks, Chris. That's a great thought. And I want to end off with a question that Todd Richards posed, more for food for thought. We're all specialists in our own environment. Todd said, firstly, I want to thank you for organizing this discussion, bringing together security and safety professionals on such short notice. The opportunity to discuss, reinforce core processes and share ideas is invaluable. What plans are in place for further sharing or providing updated resources, materials or information or guidance to ensure we maintain momentum and continue to improve? I'm hoping there are no further instances in the US, but as we know, the current geopolitical situation is quite volatile. And it's not if, but when this will happen again somewhere else. I think that's a very pertinent statement that I can that I leave you with. With that in mind, I wish you a good evening. Thank you for joining us. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you to my panelists, Gav here in Australia, Mike and Chris. We're at 11 o'clock, if I'm not mistaken, where you are. So thank you very much for being up at this late hour. Rista Solution is offering an active arm offender program on our online training academy. For those of you that would like to do the course, it's an online self-paced program. The information is up on your screen at the moment. So please feel free to use the QR code and you have free access to that course. So with that in mind, we have gone 4 minutes over. Thank you for bearing with us. It was a terribly interesting discussion, which could have carried on for another hour. So thank you very much. Good afternoon, good evening, and good night.